So everyone's been talking about Thomas Massie, and I realized after watching his interview with Tucker Carlson why Mr. No is a controversial member of Congress. Let's dive in. This is Hey Brittany, welcome back. The interview that we're covering is from June 7th, 2024. I started watching this interview because in one of my last videos, I did the interview with Marjorie Taylor Greene and Megyn Kelly, and in that conversation, in that interview, they brought up Thomas Massie, and basically they were just singing his praises. I've also heard Candace talk about him, and so I wanted to know more about this person that everyone keeps bringing up and what exactly he is all about. And I was also very confused because he looks different now than he did back then. So back then when I first heard his name, he had glasses, no facial hair, and then now there's a new guy popping up and he doesn't have glasses anymore and he has a beard, a gray beard. And so I'm like, are there two Thomas Massies? Like, what's going on? Because I don't know him well enough to be able to say, hey, that's him, he just has facial hair. So to me, it looks like two completely different people. That was what drew my interest because I think I saw a clip of him on the Theo Von show and it said Thomas Massie. I was like, that does not look like Thomas Massie. Who is this guy? And so that kind of got my interest sparked in learning more about Thomas Massie, but I hadn't really put in the work yet to watch any of his interviews or any of his speeches or any of his comments that he's made to kind of give an indication of what he is all about. Now, in terms of where he's controversial, so his whole thing, because he is Mr. No, his whole thing is that he basically votes no on a bunch of different bills. And so I guess the controversial part of this is when you are the only person or when you are the minority voting no on something, is this strategy really effective? So before we get into the topics discussed in this interview, I do want to bring up something that came up during the interview. This was kind of by an accident. So if I didn't search for something, I was searching to look up to see what his house looked like because I was learning in this interview that he built his house from scratch. And so I wanted to Google to find the pictures of his house to see like what the, I guess, final progress was. And for some reason, as I was searching for pictures of his house, I went to images. There was a box that basically said something about the anti-lynching bill. And so I was like, oh, what is that? And so I clicked on it. And so if I hadn't been searching for his house, I wouldn't have come across it. And really, I just wanted to do this video based on the interview. But however, with me seeing that bill, I did want to read up a little bit more on him just to make sure that I knew a little bit more about him going into this interview. The thing that came up when I was looking at his house was the anti-lynching bill, and this was something that he voted against, and he gave 4 reasons why he voted against this on Twitter. The first 2 reasons are basically combined, so he was basically saying that this is a state issue, and then also that states already have criminal laws against this type of hate crime. And then the other thing was the concern about conspiracy with people who I guess are part of conversations to harm someone because of their race, that type of crime, the crime to commit conspiracy, would basically open the door to other liberties being kind of, I guess, in question or up in the air, that sort of thing. And then the other thing that he brought up was that lynching was basically already a crime. So in passing this bill, it gave off the impression that lynching wasn't considered a crime and that nothing was being done about it. So I wanted to make sure that I brought that up as we go through the different topics. And just to give you a little bit more about the anti-lynching bill, the Emmett Till Anti-lynching Act. So this was signed into law on March 29th, 2020. And there were 200 attempts prior to this to get this into law, so it finally passed. And then the argument for why this bill is needed is that basically, even though there may be laws at the state level, 46 states had state laws against hate crime. And at the time of this bill being discussed, basically what the general perspective was that yes, it may be a crime to lynch someone, but perpetrators were not being held accountable. If you have it at a federal level, then it would be more severe, and hopefully more people would be held accountable because of the passing of this bill. One other thing that I want to go into that is not related to this topic of the anti-lynching bill, but this is just kind of like an aside. So you know that I've covered the beef between Candace, Nick, and Tucker, and the whole thing in terms of how Tucker got dragged into it was he called Nick a Fed, and then also he apparently lied about whether or not his dad was in the CIA. And so I found it super interesting because yes, Nick exposed like, hey, your dad was in Voice of America, he was in the CIA, how did you not know this, you knew this, and so on. And so I know that they point back to an interview with Sean Ryan on June 3rd of 2024, which is when it was published. I don't know when it was actually filmed. However, in listening to this interview with Thomas Massie, Voice of America did come up in this interview, and interestingly, Tucker did not address it, so I don't know if he didn't respond to that part of the comment in the actual interview and it just got cut out, or if he actually did not respond to it, which makes me wonder which interview was filmed first. But I did just think that that was interesting that that came up in this interview and it was kind of glossed over from how the interview was edited, cut, whatever. So I wanted to bring that up because that did catch my eye. Okay, so now moving on. So in this interview, they talked about the military-industrial complex. Massie was talking about how it had a new name. And basically at this part of the interview, they were talking about how we spent $50 billion for Afghanistan, and then we're spending more per year to help Ukraine. And they were also talking about the Biden letter, and this is basically advocating for the military-industrial complex and saying, hey, we don't have any wars to fight. We have weapons, let's send them over. We basically need to keep our military-industrial base strong. We need to get active, that sort of thing. And so they were just willing and eager to kind of jump into this just because it would help strengthen the military-industrial base. And the reason for this is because at the time, we didn't really have any wars to fight in. And so if we're not fighting in wars, what good is the military-industrial complex? So it makes sense in that sense to get involved in wars that other countries are fighting. And I really like how Tucker framed this as exporting death. And he was just saying that this is what we're known for, what America is known for. Like, how certain countries, they are known for exporting something. So like how Germany is known for exporting its cars, Tucker was saying in this sense, America is exporting death because we are participating and encouraging all of these different wars because it helps benefit us. And I really like that Massie pointed out that yes, we're getting involved in all of these different wars, and as a result, it is making people hate the US, making people hate the United States because we are causing chaos in their way of life and all of that stuff. And he was saying that that generates ill will from those other countries towards Americans and America, and that doesn't really help us either. Now, as far as what Massie's stances are on different issues, he does clarify that he's against proxy wars, sanctions on other countries, sending money overseas, and he's also for free speech. And in relation to Israel, he brought up the definition of anti-Semitism, and he was talking about how they were basically trying to pass a bill or something like that, and it had the definition of anti-Semitism, and it was pointing to some website, some URL that wasn't really based in the United States. And so he was basically saying the things being put forth in Congress to pass anti-Semitism laws, and they gave the example of not being able to talk about anti-Semitism on college campuses, and then one of the examples of anti-Semitism was quoting the New Testament or passages from the Bible. And so obviously that creates some gray areas, because if you are a religious person and you are quoting the Bible, there are things that you could say that could get you in trouble based on this definition of anti-Semitism. I think it's good that both Massie and MTG clarify that they're not against Israel, but they can be against the way things are being done. And Massie did make the point to clarify that he is against them bombing people in Gaza because 1% of the Gaza civilian population has been killed as a result of this war. This leads me to the conversation with Jillian Michaels and how she was saying only 2% of white people own slaves. So in that sense, this number is super low. But in this context of Thomas Massie saying that he was alarmed and concerned by this number of people who are being killed, and I guess the question here is 2% too low? Is 1% too high? I guess you could say that it depends on the context, but either way, it both kind of comes down to not valuing human life. It depends on what the numbers mean to you, what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. And Thomas Massie went on to talk about basically how he was approached by AIPAC. They wanted him to write a white paper, and he didn't really go into what that is, but I would imagine that it's some sort of paper or some sort of written document that backs up whatever Israel wants or whatever is being asked for. And he was basically saying like, hey, I'm not doing your homework for you, I'm refusing to do this. And basically he was saying that this is a way to kind of get you to do little things so that you do bigger things when you have more influence, because he was saying that they they kind of look for new people, freshmen, that sort of thing, to build those relationships with, so that when those people become congressmen or very influential, they have a little bit more sway and they are more likely to do whatever the AIPAC is asking for if they already have that established working relationship. And I really love the analogy that he gave about a brand new car being scratched. And so he was saying that there was some bill that he voted against, and he was the only one who voted against it. And he was saying that this was such a kind of like a trigger for AIPAC, because the idea of you want something to pass through with everyone voting for it. You don't want any kind of blemishes or stain or anything that kind of creates controversy around getting something passed. And I can absolutely relate to that analogy, because when I was younger, I did have OCD, and I felt like if a desk at school was crooked or something like that, I had to get up and fix it. And so in that sense, if I have something brand new and there's a scratch on it, for me, it almost ruins the thing, or it does ruin the thing, because it's not brand new anymore. It feels damaged and tainted. And so I would either not use it anymore, not wear it anymore, or I would go out and buy another one to replace it, because that scratch really bothers me. So I can relate to what he's saying here, and I can understand why, if any organization is trying to do something and they want it to be pure and untainted, and when someone either goes against it or whatever, that ruins it, and you almost have to start over again because you are aiming for that perfect response to whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. This leads me into the conversation on AIPAC and FAIR. So we talked about this in the episode that I did on the MTG and Megyn Kelly interview. And basically this is just reiterating the fact that AIPAC doesn't have to register as a foreign interest group because they are Americans. So they live in America. They're not people who live in Israel who are coming to Washington just to advocate for Israel. There are people based in America and people who live in America. So they kind of fall into a different category. And he also talks about how basically everyone in Congress has a AIPAC guy. And so this is funny because this is like calling your tax guy or your car guy or your watch guy or your suit guy or your shoe guy. And so these are kind of casual things that would be more acceptable, but I guess having an AIPAC guy is bad because it's sort of like this buddy system. It's how he was describing it, where you meet up with this person, you get lunch with them, you're working on building this relationship between you and somebody who is representing or advocating for another country. And he's saying that because everyone has this, it's kind of normal, and he is one of the people who do not have a buddy system with someone in AIPAC. And just to clarify, he was saying that everyone on the Republican side has an AIPAC guy, but I know that he doesn't. And then Marjorie Taylor Greene also said that she is not participating in this. She and Massie, I believe, have both banned AIPAC from coming to their offices. And he also talked about people taking a trip to Israel, and he didn't go into much detail, but he was basically saying that he was one out of 12 people who have not taken the trip to Israel. And I don't know if he meant like in all of Congress or if he meant just on the Republican side. And connecting this back to AIPAC, he was basically talking about how AIPAC is a little bit different because they are allowed to operate a little bit differently than other foreign interest groups. And then also he was talking about propaganda in a general sense, and he was saying that Russia is different because they engage in propaganda, but it's more obvious, I guess, when they're doing it. And then also he talked about how we Americans do the same thing. And then this is where he brought up the Voice of America, and he's basically saying that all countries engage in propaganda where they're trying to influence either their own people or another country into doing whatever it is that they want. And so I guess in that sense, this is not a bad thing, but I want to speak to this because Megyn Kelly is getting a lot of flack for this, because, and also Marjorie Taylor Greene, because in their interview, they talked about what was going on in Gaza, and Megyn Kelly brought up how there were images of starving kids and all of this stuff, and she was saying that it's Palestinian propaganda, and I believe she was trying to say that she thinks Hamas is deliberately not letting people get food, so that results in people starving, and then that's what people take a picture of. I don't think she was saying that the pictures completely are fake or they're non-existent. And so I did watch a YouTuber who basically was saying that, and I was confused because that's not what I understood her to mean. I thought she was saying that they were creating situations to where people could take these pictures and in a sense creating propaganda because they want you to photograph the most horrific things so that it gets a reaction out of you. But I didn't think that she was saying that there's no starving people, there's no bombing or anything like that going on in Gaza. It's all made up. And so I just wanted to comment on that. Moving into the next topic, they talked about the Russian war, the State Department, and Skiffs. So I've never heard of Skiffs before, and I guess this is basically where you get kind of debriefed on classified info from the State Department, other high-up people, and he was basically talking about how when you go to meet these people, you can't have electronics on, you can't repeat the information, and so he was talking about situations where he would hear classified information, but he can't tell his staffers about this and all of this stuff, and then he obviously can't repeat any of the classified information in this interview. And so he was talking about Mike Johnson, and he was basically saying that Mike Johnson and him went to a skiff where they heard classified information, and then for whatever reason Mike Johnson was doing a 180 on some issues because of that. And so he was pointing out like, hey, you know, we went to the same skiff, I haven't changed my stances or anything like that. Whatever is causing you to do that is not because of what you learned in that skiff. And so I thought that was interesting because I don't know a whole lot about Mike Johnson either. And one of the things that came up is they were talking about Mike Johnson and saying that his past life prior to being involved in politics didn't really prepare him for the role that he has now, and possibly saying that he is influenced by Democrats, and so they would not want him to be removed as Speaker of the House because he's actually helping them to implement their agenda. And so one thing that came up was that Thomas Massie, his past career prior to politics actually prepared him for politics. I did not know that he was an inventor. I did not know that he had his own company. I kind of knew that he was into off-the-grid living, but I didn't know a whole lot about it. And so he started this company, I think it has to do with virtual reality, and he raised $32 million in venture capital. He had his own business, obviously, and then he was saying that he had to learn to swim with the sharks because of it, and he was all about being loyal to the people who started the company with him. And he gave this example of how an investor was saying, hey, you know, get rid of this guy, we'll double our investment and all of this stuff. And so he was saying, no, I'm going to be loyal to this guy because he started this with me and so on. And so he's demonstrating, hey, you know, I know what it's like to be in a swamp, to have to stick it out, to tough it out and deal with all of this craziness, and then also I'm loyal to my people. And just to continue on the subject of Skiffs, what he talked about was that you don't actually get classified information in these debriefings, and he was talking about how there's a Facebook level, there's a Twitter level, and then a New York Times level. And so obviously he's just putting humor on these debriefs and what information that he learned from these conversations. But he was also talking about how they get classified information, or sometimes they have to kind of fight for what information they're given. And he was basically saying that three-letter agencies, so like the CIA, the FBI, and so on, they don't really have to be transparent with Congress, to people who are dictating and kind of approving their funding. They don't really have to account to Congress for whatever it is they're doing and what information they have. And so he made the joke of saying, well, you know, if we just withhold one ink toner from the FBI, they'll give us all of this information because they can't be without this toner of ink. And so that was just a funny example to say how reliant these three-letter agencies are on Congress, is my interpretation of what he was saying. Now, going into Russia, he was basically saying that people equate Putin, Russia, and Trump together. And so if there's anything that they can do to kind of punish Russia or call attention to Russia, they'll do it, because by extension, they're also doing that to Trump. And so he was just saying that there is this argument that it's good to have a war with Russia because it weakens them, so they are not as powerful as a country, because their resources are being diminished if they're constantly having to fight a war, and it makes them kind of less of an enemy in a sense. And I thought it was interesting because in the Megyn Kelly and MTG interview, they talked about the difference between the Israel and Gaza war and how you can kind of see the destruction, all of that, but there's not that much information, I think, coming from Russia or Ukraine or something like that. So I thought that was interesting because in this interview, which is from a year ago, Thomas Massie was saying that in terms of the Ukrainian and Russian war, we know how many Russians have died, but we don't know how many Ukrainians have died. And so there is this idea of we don't know what's true, we don't know what's real, and we don't know what we care about more in a sense. Like we know what numbers we're given, but we don't have a full picture of everything that is happening. And so I think that that's an interesting conversation around propaganda and how you're being influenced to make decisions based on the information that is given to you or information that is being left out of the conversation when you have to make these important decisions. The other thing that came up in this interview was this whole idea of congressmen and blackmail. He didn't think that there was any evidence of blackmail. He kind of attributed everything going on in Washington to the need to be liked. So if you are elected, it's because people like you. You have to be liked in order to get elected. And so he gave this story of a woman who's like, hey, we voted for this guy to go to Congress. Why did he turn out bad, or why is he not doing what we ask of him? And basically he was just saying that when you're in Congress, if you don't stick to your values and your morals, you're trying to be liked by everybody, and so you have so many different people to please that you're going to drop the ball somewhere. And so he was saying that he doesn't have this desire to be liked, which is why he's Mr. No. He's an independent, and he's okay with standing out and standing firm on some issues that he believed there should be someone voting no for, just to send a strong message that he is not for a particular bill or whatever the situation may be. And I thought it was interesting that Massie is saying that he doesn't have this desire to be liked or to be liked at the expense of giving something up. They were also saying that he doesn't really have any enemies in Congress, which is interesting because if you have someone who is constantly voting no on something and blocking something that you are trying to do, you would grow to dislike that person. So I thought it was interesting that they were saying that basically people may dislike him at times, but he doesn't have any actual enemies, which is pretty interesting. So I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not sure what people in Congress actually think of him, but I've heard his name enough times to know that people think highly of him. So I'm interested in knowing what you guys think about Thomas Massie, so let me know in the comment section below. Now, in terms of a situation where he did get a lot of people angry at him, he was talking about the CARES Act and how this led to this feud with Trump. And so basically the CARES Act was what determined financial support during the pandemic. And basically they were going to vote on this bill, but they did not have nearly enough people there. I think there were like 2 or 5 people there, and they were all just going to vote for this bill. And he was like, no, we need a quorum. We need 218 people here to vote on this. And so basically during the pandemic, everyone is kind of sequestered and holed up in their homes, and they're being forced to come back to Washington in order to vote. And so people are very angry at him for making them do this, making them leave their homes and endangering their family's health and all of this stuff. And so he was saying, other people, everyday people, they still have to work, and why are you more important than them? You make a lot of money, you have access to the best healthcare, so if there are other people who are having to put their lives on the line, you can do the same thing by coming to Washington to vote. And so he was saying that basically by forcing people to come to Washington to vote on this issue, a lot of people were angry about him. He got a lot of negative press about this. And then he even tells this story about where Trump called him and was basically pissed at him for doing this. And then he was basically saying, I'm not going to endorse you. I'm going to make sure that I support whoever your opposition is and all of this stuff. And he did a really good imitation of Trump in this moment. And so I do want to play that so that we can listen to that.
And so he comes on and he goes, I'm coming at you like you've never seen. Never in your life before. Have you seen the way in which I will come at you? I'm more popular than you in Kentucky, and you know it. I'm backing your primary opponent, and you're gonna lose.
Okay, yeah, so that was pretty funny to hear him do like the impersonations of Trump. He sounded exactly like him. And so basically he was just talking about how in that clip, Trump gets wind of this very quickly. He doesn't have the number to call Trump, which is interesting. Even the switchboard operator knows to put the call through immediately and all of that stuff. And then he's talking about how Trump is just really upset with him. And so I just thought it was funny that he was able to share this story. He was able to imitate Trump perfectly. And then also he's speaking on the relationship that they have, because I guess this was a public thing. And even now this is being talked about in relation to Megyn Kelly and MTG's interview where they were asking like, hey, is Trump still good with Massie? Why are they on the outs? That sort of thing. And so it seems like they really butt heads based on this conversation because they're talking about something that happened, I think, back in 2020. And so now we're hearing about more friction between Trump and Massie and whatever's going on with that situation. And then I think after everything in 2020, they did patch things up and Trump endorsed Massie in 2022. And then also Tucker was saying like, hey, he didn't like that you were blocking him or whatever, but he respects the fact that you stood up and were trying to do the right thing. And so it was a huge thing in the media. I don't remember it happening. I remember bits and pieces about the pandemic, but I don't remember anything as far as politics and little feuds and spats and all of that stuff. And so it was good to hear kind of this story for the first time, even though MTG kind of talked about a little bit of a drama, but it was just good to hear him tell it in his own words. And then also the funny thing that he talked about was this Christmas photo, which I had never heard of either. And so basically he was talking about taking a Christmas photo. They were playing bluegrass instruments and he switched out the instruments for machine gun and tweeted this while he was drunk or whatever and got a lot of backlash for this. And I guess if you're a Second Amendment guy, you want to have guns, then yeah, you would find this funny. But it's also kind of like a very hillbilly type of thing to do. And so I don't love it, but I understand why he did it, but I also don't think it sent a good message to the general public about how you feel about guns and what other unconscious messages you're sending in tweeting that picture. Okay, so the other pretty cool thing that they talked about was Massie building his house, and so he revealed he has 1,500 acres of land. He is living completely off the grid. They have powered their house using a Tesla car, and so they don't really have to rely on any public utilities. And so he built his house from scratch. I think he was saying that there was a storm and a bunch of trees knocked over, so he was able to use those trees to build his house, and he had to do all of like the woodwork in order to make the wood, I guess, ready to build his house. And he is a electrical engineer, so he was able to figure out all of his stuff, which is pretty cool. And I thought it was funny that he made this remark at the end, towards the end of the video, like, hey, for the women listening who might think that this is a cool way to live, just ask my wife. And so I thought that was funny because I did think that it was a cool way to live. And obviously I don't know any of his stuff that he's talking about, but it was really fascinating to hear how much effort he put into building his house and putting all the pieces together and making things work. He talked about how he built his own house, and then they clarified like, hey, this is not plantation land, because I know that Blake Lively got in trouble for getting married on a plantation or a former plantation. And so he clarified that where he lives in that area is not suitable for plantation work, for slavery, farming work, and all of that stuff. And so he talked about how in that area historically, I guess, they just had their own haulers, their own plots of land that they farmed for themselves, and if they needed help, they would rely on neighbors and that sort of thing. And so it just seemed like they were very small farmers. They're really focused on themselves and their family while also supporting their local community without relying on slavery. But then also people talk about how when you get into like this southern kind of hillbilly type of environment, there are racist elements or just racism in general when you're dealing with people in those types of situations and climates and all of that stuff. And so, yes, she clarified like, hey, we're not associated with slavery, which goes back to the Jillian Michaels thing where only 2% of white people own slavery, but it's all interconnected. So even if you didn't have slaves, you still benefited from the institution of slavery somehow. And so he was just talking about what it's like to live off the grid and the different issues that he's had to fix. And then there was the issue of how he got into politics, and he was saying that the local jail, they had a jail for, I guess, state inmates and then local inmates. And basically for the state inmates who had more serious crime, their hot water boiler broke or whatever, so they couldn't take a shower with hot water. And so it's going to cost $12,000 to replace it. He was like, hey, that's too much. We're going to find a better way to do this. And so he bought something from eBay for $5,500, and he was able to figure it all out. And then he was just telling this story about the prisoners, and he was obviously kind of not necessarily discriminating against them, but he was using the fact of what they were in jail for. Obviously, I don't know if all of these people were in jail for stealing or whatever, and I don't even know what the race of these people were, but he was basically saying that these people were in prison or in jail because they were stealing stuff, stripping things of value off of whatever they were stealing, and then selling that to make money. And so he was talking about how he was putting this boiler together. He only wanted one inmate in there with him, but then he was also talking about how fascinated they were with what he was doing. And then he talked about how he took a sticker off, like a license sticker off of the original boiler and put it on the new one, which he was not supposed to do. And so he was just talking about how he was kind of budget friendly or cheap and tries to figure out things without spending a whole lot of money. And then he was also talking about how difficult it is to live off the grid, in the sense of if something breaks, you need to figure out, and he's the only one who kind of knows to that degree how to fix the system and all of that stuff. And so he was talking about how he has to be the one to fix things, and if you don't know how to do any of that stuff, then obviously it's going to be more difficult for you. I did like that he basically said that he doesn't know everything, but when he wants to learn something, he either takes a class or he buys 3 books on whatever topic he's trying to learn, and then if there's 2 books that disagree, there's 1 book that is the tiebreaker that helps him figure stuff out. And so obviously it depends on what books you're buying. I would assume that you're either buying 3 books that kind of say the same thing, or you're deliberately looking for authors of whatever topics who have opposing views, so that you can kind of get the full picture and figure out what you actually need to do, where that middle line is. So yeah, that's most of the things that they talked about in this interview. I didn't want to spend too much time on it because I did not want this video to be as long as the interview itself, but there were a lot of good topics that they talked about, and Massie seems generally very likable in this interview, but I do want to learn more about what he's all about, so I will be watching his interview with Theo Von just to see kind of how things have changed since this first interview came out in June 7th of 2024. I don't know when the interview with Theo Von was released. It might have been released in the last 2 months or so. So hopefully there's enough change in there and they talk about different topics or whatever, so that there's some differences between this interview with Tucker Carlson and the one with Theo Von. And one thing I wanted to call out, more so related to Tucker Carlson, so I've noticed that in some of his interviews, there's a point that he wants to make or something that he wants everyone else, I guess, to take away from whatever is being discussed. And so there was a moment where they were talking about something being wrong, like morally wrong, and Thomas Massie didn't come out and say it like that. And so Tucker kind of over-talked him to like make that point, like, hey, you know, this is wrong. I can't remember what they were discussing, but I think it was early on in the interview. That also made me think of his interview with Candace, where he was talking about Nick Fuentes, and then Candace interjected to say, hey, you know, he said I was taking Russian money and blah, blah, blah. And Tucker just kind of continued talking like as if she didn't say anything. And so I thought it was funny because I don't know if he does that a lot, to where he really tries to make sure that he gets his point across, or whatever method he thinks is important for the audience. And so I guess he's just really assertive like that to make sure that you hear exactly what he thinks of something. And so that was just something that stuck out to me. I don't know if that's super relevant or anything like that. So yeah, this was a good interview to watch, and I'm looking forward to the one with Theo Von. And in terms of interviews, if there's any recommendations that you guys have in terms of watching other Republicans and their interviews, or any Democrats and their interviews, definitely let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.